I've been thinking lately about getting back into the shock building deal, and there's a lot of things that are going to go into that. But then I got watching Speed Weeks here, and I've noticed a trend in cars in two different directions. So let's roll the intro video, and I'm going to talk a little bit about shock valving and how the cars are working and what's going on, what I perceive is what's going on in shocks today. I've spent the last 30 plus years working on race cars, building race cars, and racing cars. And I'm here to help you better understand racing technology. First of all, I was thinking about getting back into the shock building business, and I think if we're going to do this, we're going to probably start off with Integra late model stuff. I know we're not going to have a large, vast rebuild toolkit. I still have a lot of my old tools that I used to use. So we're going to roll into this thing a slower. I got a car I'm going to help out, get some shock stuff done. But I really wanted to talk about what I see going on in shocks after I've dynoed from a couple different builders. I really wanted to talk about what the two differences kind of in shock mentality is going on. The big differences, all rebuilders do a little bit of something different, but what I see is the big differences between the builders. The first type of build mentality I see is tying down the right front. Everybody ties the right front down to a certain degree today. But the first type of mentality is to tie down the right front excessively and add a little compression to the left rear front. This is the mentality that I like the best. The other mentality says you add a ton of compression to the left rear front, and the right front isn't tied down as much. It's kind of does the same thing as you want to keep that car rocked up on the right front and keep the left rear high. But here is the difference that I see between the two and what we need to do to make sure that we get all the traction we can. So tying down the right front, I think, is a better way of going about it, because I've always believed to get the most traction in your car, you have to relax that left rear and get that left rear tire and the right rear to dig into the track on acceleration. To get that to happen, I think that the left rear needs to fall just a little bit on corner entry to relax that just enough to keep traction in the left rear tire. I don't think you can have, except for very maybe abrasive tracks or a lot of grip in tracks, where you can stand that thing up on the left rear and have all your traction just go through the flexibility of the tire. I think, when the tracks get slick or there's limited traction out there, you need to have that suspension give a little bit to help the left rear and the right rear hold traction. But the key to this, holding the right front down, is you don't want to hold the right front down into a position where you are at max droop on the left rear. I think you need to have a little bit more height here. So as your car rolls up onto the right front and you hit, a bump stop or, your harsh lockout spring or something, to keep that car at that certain ride height on the right front, I think you need to have the car hit that before your chain gets you to max droop on the left rear. Because that's going to give you a little more chain, a little more flexibility on that left rear to gain the traction and get up to your full droop. Which means that your car will drop a little bit, not much. You don't want it to fall and then you get a tight conditions, but you will want it to drop a little bit on your left rear to maintain the traction. So if you're getting back in the throttle or you turn the car and the car is trying to accelerate, or you pinch the car to get around underneath somebody, when that left rear and the right rear, when that left rear goes to regain traction, it's got a little bit of a give there yet. You still want to keep the car up in the air and keep it at an aerodynamic positive situation. But I don't think locking the suspension on the left rear is the answer. So what I would basically do is when you roll up on your right front, you'll have your spring set up, and you want it to get soft enough on that right front, so all you have to do is shake the car and get it close. And then once you're kind of sitting on that platform on the right front, the left rear gaining traction is going to give you just that little bit of extra, and you'll be able to maintain the traction without blowing the tire off or both tires off in the rear. So that's the critical part. And then tuning that rebound on the right front to maintain that traction and maintain that angle. The stiffer the spring you go with on the bottom, you're going to need more rebound, because the rebound is going to need to hold that thing up on that stop. The softer your bottom spring or the softer your finished spring rate is down there, the less rebound, because you won't have as much spring tension on that. So the rebound you put in these shocks is going to really depend on your bottom spring rate, your bump stop, where it's all located. And that's what I'm going to try to do when I start revalving shocks. The next thing I want to talk about is getting back to this whole speed and time situation. Back in the day, I had Weir's Machine punch out some special shock mounts for our cars. And they were shortened shock mounts that got the left rear front closer to the center line of the left rear axle tube. This actually slowed down the left rear, and as you slow down the left rear front shock, it's easier to maintain a low rebound for the most traction. Because picture your axle wrapping in. The closer that is to the center line of the shock, the less distance it has to travel in the same amount of time. And remember, our shocks are actually built into a time and distance thing. The faster the shock goes, the more rebound or compression it's naturally going to have with the design and the hydraulics on the piston. You can go to a digressive shock, but there's still going to be a little bit of drag there the faster the shock wants to go. And stiction gets into a big part of it. The stickier that shock is set into position, when it gets ready to accelerate, the faster it's got to accelerate, the stiction's going to prevent that. So you want that shock to move as slow as possible on that left rear front. Now you don't want to get the shock too close to the axle tube where you're bending things and wrecking things, but it's important to try to do every little bit you can to that left rear front rebound to get as most traction as you can to the car. I have a little drawing I set up, so let's go over to the drawing board and I'll kind of show you the drawing I have set up, and hopefully it clarifies this whole shock mount deal just a little bit better. This is an example I made up here to show exactly what I mean by reducing the shock mounts, the distance from the center line of the axle to where the shock goes. With a normal piston on a shock, a linear piston, the faster it goes, the more resistance it gets. You can put a digressive piston in there and valve it a little bit, but that's just the normal nature of pistons and hydraulics, is the faster it goes, the more resistance. So basically, if you want to reduce the traction on the left rear front, you put a longer shock mount on there. To go from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, it will take the same amount of time, but if you decrease the distance from the center line of the axle to where the shock mount is, the shock will actually slow down. Because when your car rolls over to go from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, it's always going to go in the same amount of time, but the shorter the shock mount is, the less distance it travels. So it will slow down and it will keep that shock in a lower inches per second reading. It'll actually add traction to your left rear. Less rebound equals more traction. If you put a longer shock mount on your left rear and it's sticking out there quite a bit, it has to go a longer distance in the same amount of time, so it has to go faster. So anytime on your left rear front you can shorten up that distance from the shock mount to the center line of the axle, the less rebound and the more traction you'll have. Way back when, I had Weir's Machine punch out some special shock mounts for me, and they were placed closer to the center line of the axle because that's what exactly I was trying to get to, and we had some traction back then. Now I think I saw it in his catalog. He is making these shock mounts available for everybody to buy. I saw something in there about a shortened shock mount or something, so maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know what's going on there. He might offer a shock mount that is shorter to get it closer to the center line of the axle. Now, this same principle will hold true for the right rear. Your right rear will index to the same way as your left rear indexes, except for it will be in compression. So when you put your shock on the front of that right rear, you can tune it for how fast that shock indexes in and gets stiffer, and how much more side bite faster it gets, or you can slow it down depending on the length of shock mount you put in that right rear front lower there. So keep that in mind. Actually, anywhere on your car, this is the same principle of speed versus time. I did it with shock mounts to try to get the left rear rebound as little as possible on our cars. If you like this video and you like other videos I make, subscribe to the channel, smash the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.